I never meant to be remembered. My life was supposed to pass quietly, like a breath dissolving into winter air, leaving no trace once the cold moved on. Yet here I am, writing these words as if they could hold the weight of everything I've seen, everything I've felt, everything I should never have touched. Perhaps it is cowardice to confess to paper instead of to the faces I betrayed. But ink does not judge, and silence has always been kinder to me than voices. I say that when you stare into the eyes of a vampire, you see eternity. What they don't tell you is that eternity looks back, and it hungers. Not for blood, though that too, but for something far more dangerous: connection. To be seen by something that has lived 1,000 lifetimes. To matter to something that should have forgotten how to care centuries ago is to be marked in ways that never fade. I was nobody. A servant girl in the Ashford estate, one of those grand Gothic mansions perched on the hills above the city, where old money and older secrets breathed in the walls. The Ashfords were what people called legacy wealthy, the kind of rich that doesn't need to prove itself, that simply exists like gravity, pulling everything into its orbit. And I was dust, invisible, meant to clean their floors and serve their meals and disappear before they remembered. I had a face. But there was a night, I can still feel it in my bones, when the world shifted beneath me. Not with thunder or fire, but with the fragile tremor of a glance, the kind that pierces deeper than any blade. I was only a servant then, a girl with calloused hands and a heart too soft for the cruelty of marble halls. But in that moment, when my eyes met his, I understood what it meant to be both chosen and condemned. His name was Dante Ashford, and he was not human. I write these words as if they were a wound I cannot close. Every sentence feels like peeling back skin to expose the rawness beneath. Perhaps that is what memory does. It refuses to let scars form. It insists on bleeding again and again. I was not born for mansions, nor for the weight of secrets that could topple empires. I was born in hunger, in the dust of forgotten streets, where children learned early that silence was safer than truth. Yet somehow, silence betrayed me. It carried me into halls, where whispers were sharper than knives, and where my own heart became the most dangerous weapon I possessed. The city below the hill was divided, though no one spoke of it openly. There were those who lived in light, the wealthy, the powerful, the ones whose names appeared in newspapers and charity galas. And then there were the rest of us, those who lived in the margins in the shadows cast by their glittering towers. We served them, cleaned for them, bled for them in factories and kitchens and back alleys, and we pretended not to notice that some of them never aged, that some of them moved through the decades like statues that breathed. The vampires had always been here. That's what my mother told me before she died, her voice thin as paper, her eyes hollow from years of night shifts at the textile mill. She told me they'd always been here, in the old families, in the bloodlines. That they didn't call themselves that, of course. They called themselves legacy holders, or the founding families. But we knew what they were. We'd always known. I was 12 when she said that. 14 when she died. 16 when I took her place as a servant in the Ashford estate, desperate for the wages that might keep my younger brother Micah fed and housed. The estate was like something out of a Gothic novelette, dark wood and stained glass, with corridors that seemed to shift in the shadows and rooms that felt like they were holding their breath. The servants whispered about the family, about how Mr. Lucian Ashford had looked exactly the same in photographs from 50 years ago, about how his son Dante never seemed to eat, never seemed to sleep, never seemed to exist in the daylight, about the locked rooms in the West Wing and the strange deliveries that arrived in unmarked vehicles at midnight. But we were paid well, better than any other household in the city. And so we stayed, and we served, and we kept our eyes lowered. I remember the first time I felt truly seen. It was not by the man who would later haunt my nights, nor by the child whose loneliness mirrored my own. It was by the moment itself, that fragile instant when the world seemed to hold its breath. And I realized I had crossed a threshold I could never return from. My hands trembled, not from fear of punishment, but from the unbearable weight of connection. To be noticed in a place built on indifference is a kind of violence, and yet I craved it. They told me to keep my eyes lowered, to move like smoke through the corridors, to serve without being remembered. But I was never good at being invisible. My body betrayed me, the way my fingers lingered on the silver trays, the way my gaze wandered to the faces I was forbidden to study. I carried hunger in my bones, not just for bread, but for meaning, for something that could make the ache of existence worth enduring. And when I found it, it was not in the arms of safety, but in the dangerous pull of forbidden eyes. The boy, Dante's son, lived in the East Wing. His name was Elias, and he was 7 years old, though his eyes held centuries of sorrow. The other servants said he was cursed, that he couldn't speak, that his mother had died giving birth to him and left him broken in ways that even vampire blood couldn't heal. They said his father kept him hidden away, ashamed of an heir who would never be strong enough to lead. I first saw him on a Tuesday evening, when I was assigned to deliver his dinner tray. The other servants had refused. They said the boy was unsettling, that his silence made them uncomfortable, that they could feel him staring even when they weren't looking. But I needed the extra wages, and so I volunteered. His room was at the end of a long corridor, where the gaslights flickered and died before they could reach the door. I knocked softly, and when no answer came, I pushed the door open. He sat by the window, small and pale as moonlight, his dark hair falling across his face. He didn't turn when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. I set the tray down on the table, my hands shaking slightly, and turned to leave. And then I saw what he was doing. He had arranged stones on the windowsills, smooth river stones, each one placed with careful precision, forming patterns I couldn't quite understand. His small fingers moved over them gently, as if they were precious things, as if they held conversations only he could hear. I recognized the loneliness in that gesture. I had done the same thing as a child, when my mother worked nights and my brother was too young to speak. I had built worlds out of nothing, had created friends from shadows and stones because silence was all I had. Without thinking, I knelt beside him and whispered that it was beautiful. He flinched, his hands freezing mid-motion. Slowly, so slowly, he turned to look at me. His eyes were silver gray, ancient and young all at once, and in them I saw a reflection of myself, a soul exiled by indifference, desperate to be understood. I should have been punished. That is what everyone expected. A servant who dared to speak, who dared to approach the heir without permission, deserved nothing less than dismissal or worse. But instead, something shifted in that moment. Something broke open between us, fragile as glass, precious as breath. He reached for my hand, not to push me away, but to pull me closer. And when his cold fingers touched mine, I felt it, the terrible weight of recognition. We were the same, he and I, two souls drowning in silence, reaching for anything that might keep us from sinking. From that moment, I belonged to him. Not as a servant, not as a subject, but as something far more dangerous. A witness. I saw the way his loneliness hollowed him out, the way his father's absence froze him into stillness, the way the household whispered about his weakness as if he were not flesh and blood, but a flaw in the family's design. And I, foolish girl, thought I could protect him. I thought my presence, my attention, my care could shield him from the cruelty of a world that devours the vulnerable. But the truth is, I was not only protecting him, I was protecting myself. Every time I sat with him, Every time his eyes lit up with recognition, I felt less invisible. His silent joy became my anchor, his trust my salvation. And yet beneath it all, there was another presence, older, heavier, impossible to ignore. His father, Dante Ashford. A man, no, a creature, carved from stone and shadow, whose silence was more terrifying than any roar. At first, I thought he despised me. His eyes cut through me like winter wind, his voice wrapped around my throat like a noose. But then I began to notice the cracks, the way his gaze lingered on his son when he thought no one was watching, the way his hands twitched, clumsy and uncertain, as if they longed to reach but had forgotten how. And when he looked at me, truly looked, I felt something shift, not mercy, not kindness, but a hunger as dangerous as my own. It is a terrible thing to be desired by something that should never desire you. His immortality was a wall between us, his power a chain around my neck. Yet when his eyes found mine, I felt stripped bare, as if he could see every secret I had ever tried to bury. I told myself it was fear, that the shiver in my spine was dread. But fear does not linger in the dark, replaying every glance, every word, every silence until it becomes a prayer. I began to write his name in the margins of my thoughts, though I never dared to speak it aloud. Dante. The sound of it was a sin, heavy and intoxicating. He was a vampire, a father, a man bound by duty and grief. I was a servant, a girl with nothing but scars and borrowed courage. And yet, in the quiet spaces between us, I felt the pull of something forbidden, something that could ruin us both. The boy was our bridge. Through him, we learned to speak, not in words, but in glances, in gestures, in the fragile language of hope. I taught Elias to smile again, and in doing so, I taught his father to see. Dante watched us in silence, his expression unreadable, but I felt his gaze like a hand pressed against my skin. Elias couldn't speak, but he could draw. I discovered this one evening when I brought him art supplies I'd purchased with my meager wages, charcoal pencils, and thick paper that felt like luxury in my hands. His eyes had widened when he saw them, and for the first time I saw something like joy flicker across his pale face. He drew constantly after that. Dark, beautiful images that seemed to pour from somewhere deep and ancient within him. He drew the moon over the cities, shadows with wings, forests made of bones, and sometimes he drew me. Not as I was plain and worn, but as something luminous, something that mattered. I would sit with him for hours, watching his small hands move across the paper, and I would tell him stories. Stories of my childhood, of my brother who had died of fever when he was only 9, of the streets below where life moved fast and desperate. And though he never spoke, I felt him listening. I felt him understanding. Dante began to appear more often during these sessions. At first, he would linger in the doorway, silent as death, his dark eyes tracking every movement. The other servants said he was over 300 years old, that he had fought in wars I'd only read about in history books, that he had loved and lost so many times he'd forgotten how to feel. But when he looked at his son, I saw the feeling, raw and painful, like a wound that had never healed. One night, after Elias had fallen asleep with his head on my lap, Dante finally spoke to me directly. His voice was like smoke, ancient, weary, beautiful in its brokenness. He told me I had given his son something he couldn't. I looked up at him, at this creature who had lived longer than nations, who could crush me without effort, who watched me with eyes that held too much knowledge and too much hunger. I whispered that I had only given Elias presents, nothing more. He repeated the word as if tasting it, then asked if I knew how rare that was, to simply exist with someone, without expectation, without judgment. He moved closer, and I felt the temperature drop. Vampires don't generate heat. They pull it from the air, from the living things around them. He told me he'd lived 3 centuries and had forgotten how to do that. Something in my chest cracked open. I heard myself telling him that maybe he should try. The silence that followed was electric. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze so intense I felt it in my bones. Then, slowly, he knelt beside us. Not above us, not standing in judgment, but level, equal. He asked me to teach him. Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of surrender. And so I did. The days blurred into one another, each morning carrying me back to Elias's room, each evening leaving me with the echo of his silent laughter in my chest. I told myself it was enough, that his joy was my purpose, that I could live and die in the shadows so long as he was no longer alone. But shadows have a way of clinging, of whispering that they are not satisfied with half a life. And in those shadows, I began to feel the weight of another gaze, heavier than the boy's fragile trust. Dante haunted me. Not in words, for he spoke to me rarely, but in presence. He filled the air like smoke, impossible to breathe without tasting. I felt him in the corridors, in the way the other servants' eyes flicked toward me as if carrying his unspoken orders. I felt him in the library, where he lingered at the edges of our sessions, his movements clumsy but determined as he tried to connect with his son, his eyes betraying a hunger he could not name. And I felt him most of all in myself, in the way my pulse betrayed me whenever he entered the room. I tried to convince myself it was pity, that the ache in my chest when I saw him kneel before his son was nothing more than compassion for a creature who had forgotten how to be a father. But pity does not burn. Pity does not linger in the dark, replaying the curve of a mouth, the weight of a glance, until it becomes unbearable. No, what I felt was something far more dangerous. Something that could not be confessed without tearing apart the fragile world we had built. Elias noticed before I did. Children always see what adults try to hide. His eyes flicked between us, curious, questioning, though he never drew the images aloud. Perhaps he feared the answer. Perhaps he understood more than I gave him credit for. He clung to me more tightly in those days, as if afraid I might vanish, as so many others had. And I, torn between guilt and longing, promised him silently that I would not leave. But promises are fragile things. They shatter under the weight of desire. And desire was growing in me like a sickness, spreading through my veins until even Elias's silent laughter could not drown it out. I began to dread the moments when Dante entered the room, not because I feared him, but because I feared myself. The household grew restless. Whispers turned to accusations, accusations to threats. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Thorne, a woman with eyes like flint and a mouth that never smiled, summoned me to her office one morning. She told me I was spending too much time with the boy, that it was inappropriate, unhealthy. She said the master had noticed. My heart stuttered. I started to say that Master Dante hadn't complained, but she interrupted me sharply. She said the master was compromised, not thinking clearly, that I had wormed my way into that child's affections, and now into his. She asked if I thought they didn't see it, if I thought the staff was blind. I wanted to defend myself, to say I was only doing my job, only caring for a lonely child. But the words died in my throat, because she was right. I had crossed lines I shouldn't have crossed. I had let myself feel things I had no right to feel. She leaned forward and told me there were whispers, dangerous whispers about me and Master Dante, about impropriety, about a human servant getting ideas above her station. I insisted I had no ideas, though my voice trembled. She asked me if I didn't, her eyes glittering. A vampire lord taking notice of a servant girl, that was a fantasy, she said. And fantasies in this house had a way of ending in blood. She dismissed me then, but her words clung like spider silk. I knew she was right. I knew I was playing with fire, or rather, with something far colder and more deadly than fire. But I couldn't stop. Elias needed me, and Dante... Dante was beginning to need me too. I heard their words in the kitchens, in the corridors. in the way the other servants avoided my gaze. Some looked at me with envy, others with pity, but none with understanding. Only Elias understood, and perhaps, though he would never admit it, Dante. For when his eyes met mine, I saw not judgment, but recognition. He was as trapped as I was, bound by duty, by grief, by the chains of immortality that weighed heavier than iron. One night, I dreamed of blood. The mansion burned around me, its Gothic walls crumbling into ash, its stained glass windows shattering into crimson shards. And in the center of the flames stood Dante, his immortality melting into his skin, his eyes fixed on mine. He reached for me, and I reached back, though I knew the fire would consume us both. When I woke, my hands were trembling, my body drenched in sweat, and I knew the dream was not a warning. It was a prophecy. For love like ours, if love it could be called, was not meant to build. It was meant to destroy. And still, I could not turn away. Elias's lessons became our sanctuary. In the library, among the dust and the ancient books, we built a world of our own. He drew his stories with hands that moved like lightning, and I translated them into words Dante could understand. And in those moments I felt as if we were a family broken, fragile, but whole in a way none of us had been before. But families built on secrets cannot last. Every smile, every glance, every touch of hands across a page was a thread pulled tighter, weaving us into a tapestry that could not remain hidden. And the household, with its sharp eyes and sharper tongues, was waiting for the moment to tear it apart. The first time Dante spoke to me alone, truly alone, I thought my heart would stop. His study was dark, the fire casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. He stood by the window, his back to me, his voice low and rough as he told me I had given his son back to him. I wanted to deny it, to say it was Elias's strength, not mine. But the words caught in my throat. When he turned, his eyes were not the eyes of a vampire lord. They were the eyes of a man, weary and desperate, clinging to something he did not know how to name. He asked me to stay, just one word, but it carried the weight of a command and a plea all at once. And I, foolish girl, obeyed. From that night on, I belonged not only to Elias, but to him. I told myself it was duty, that I stayed for the child, that I endured the whispers and the threats for his sake. But in the quiet hours, when Dante's gaze lingered too long, when his cold hand brushed mine under the pretense of reaching for the same book, I knew the truth. I stayed because I wanted to. Desire is a dangerous teacher. It makes liars of us all. I lied to Elias, to the household, to myself. I told them I was loyal, that I was selfless, that I was nothing more than a servant. But in my heart, I was already a traitor. Elias began to change. He grew bolder, more confident, his drawings more vivid and alive. He laughed more silent laughter that shook his small shoulders, smiled more, lived more. And I should have been content with that. But every time he looked at me with trust in his eyes, I felt the weight of my betrayal. For I was not only his protector, I was the thief who had stolen his father's gaze. And yet I could not stop. Dante's presence was a gravity I could not escape. Every glance was a confession, every silence a promise. We were bound together not by choice, but by inevitability. And inevitability is the cruelest prison of all. I do not know when love became sin, or when sin became survival. All I know is that I could no longer tell the difference. Elias's silent joy, Dante's gaze, the whispers of the household, they tangled together until I could not breathe without feeling the weight of them all. I was drowning, and yet I did not want to be saved. Perhaps that is the truest confession of all, that I chose this. I chose the fire, the ruin, the forbidden's hunger that consumed me. I chose to love where I should have feared, to reach where I should have retreated. And now, as I write these words, I know the ending was written from the beginning. For stories like mine do not end in happily ever after. They end in ashes. The gala was the turning point. I remember the weight of the dress they gave me, the way the fabric shimmered like water under candlelight, as if clothing could disguise the truth of what I was. The Ashfords were hosting their annual charity event, a lavish spectacle where the city's elite gathered to display their wealth and their so-called generosity to the poor they exploited daily. For the first time, Elias would be presented to society. Not hidden away, not whispered about, but shown. Dante had decided it was time for the world to see his son, to understand that silence was not weakness. I was to accompany them, not as a servant, but as Elias's companion, the one who understood him, who could interpret his drawings, who could speak for him when needed. The household was scandalized. Mrs. Thorne nearly had an apoplexy, but Dante's word was final, and so I found myself dressed in silk and pearls, standing beside immortals as if I belonged. I remember Elias's trembling hands as we stood at the top of the grand staircase, the ballroom below us filled with faces, human and vampire alike, the wealthy and the powerful, the predators and their prey. And I remember the silence, that vast, expectant hush when the crowd realized the young master would speak, not with voice, but with art. I stood between them, my body a bridge, my voice borrowed for a child who had been invisible too long. Elias held up his drawings, images of difference, of hope, of belonging rendered in charcoal and passion, and I spoke his truth into the air. Words of what it meant to be silent in a world that only valued noise, to be different in a world that demanded conformity. The crowd shifted, uncertain, then softened. Some of the younger humans in attendance began to nod, began to understand, and when a few brave souls approached Elias, asking to see more of his art, asking to understand, I felt the world tilt. For the first time, he was not alone. Dante's hand rested on his son's shoulder, steadying him, grounding him. But his eyes found me. In that moment, with hundreds watching, he looked at me as if I were the only one who understood, and perhaps I was. My voice carried his son's truth, but it also carried his own unspoken plea. See him. See us. When the applause rose like thunder, I felt tears sting my eyes. Not for myself, but for Elias who had been hidden away, for Dante who had finally chosen to show him to the world, and yet, beneath the triumph, there was fear. For I knew the old guard, both human and vampire, would not forgive us for this moment, for challenging the order of things. That night, the mansion glowed with candlelight, and music drifted through the halls. I stood on the balcony with them, Elias between us, Dante beside me. It should have been a moment of peace, of celebration. But peace is a fragile thing, and I could feel the weight of what lingered unsaid. Elias's hands flew with excitement, drawing in the air, recounting every person who had looked at his art, every smile, every gesture of recognition. I translated, my voice trembling with warmth. And when Dante caught his son's hand, slowing him, truly seeing him for perhaps the first time in years, I saw something break open in him. Pride, love, vulnerability. And when he whispered his thanks to me, I knew I was already too far gone. He told me I had given his son back to him, but the truth was harsher. I had given him back to himself. For years he had been a lord first, a father second, a man last of all. Immortality had carved him into stone, grief had hollowed him into silence. But now, with his son's drawings moving like light, with my voice carrying words he could not speak, he was learning to feel again. And I was learning to burn. Every glance, every word, every silence between us fed the fire I could not extinguish. I told myself it was for Elias, that I stayed for his sake. But in the quiet of my heart, I knew the truth. I stayed for Dante. The household did not stay silent. They never do. Whispers spread like poison. that I had bewitched Elias, that I was manipulating Dante, that I was a threat to the natural order. They called me dangerous, unworthy, a human who had forgotten her place. And perhaps they were right, for I had forgotten my place. I had dared to believe I could belong in a world that was never meant for me. But Elias needed me, and Dante, though he never said it aloud, wanted me near. So I endured the whispers, the glares, the threats. I endured because leaving would have been worse. Leaving would have meant abandoning the only two souls who had ever truly seen me. One evening, I found myself summoned to Dante's study. The fire burned low, shadows gathering in the corners. He stood by the window, his shoulders heavy with something more than the weight of centuries. When he turned to me, his eyes were not cold. They were weary, desperate, searching. He told me I had changed Elias, that I had changed him. I wanted to deny it, to say it was Elias's strength, not mine. But the words caught in my throat, for I had changed too. I was no longer the invisible servant I had once been. I was something else now, something dangerous. He asked me to stay. Just one word, but it carried the weight of 3 centuries of loneliness, of grief, of hunger for connection he'd thought long dead. And I, reckless and trembling, obeyed. I stayed in that room, in that silence, in that gaze that stripped me bare. I stayed because I could not leave. And when his hand brushed mine cold as death, gentle as a whisper, I felt the world collapse into that single touch. It was nothing, and it was everything. A promise, a betrayal, a confession neither of us dared to speak. I should have pulled away. Instead, I held on. Elias noticed. Of course he did. His eyes lingered on us, questioning, though he never drew the images aloud. Perhaps he feared the answer. Perhaps he already knew. Children see what adults try to hide. And he, more than anyone, understood the language of silence. I told myself I was protecting him, that my presence was for his sake. But the truth was crueler. I needed him as much as he needed me, and I needed his father most of all. The nights grew heavier. I dreamed of blood, of fangs at my throat, of surrendering to something that would drain me dry and leave me empty. I dreamed of cold hands pulling me into darkness, and I went willingly, though I knew it would destroy me. When I woke, my body trembled with the certainty that the dream was not a warning, but a promise. For love like ours, if love it could be called, was not meant to save. It was meant to consume. And still, I could not turn away. The turning point came on a night when the moon hung full and heavy over the city. I had put Elias to bed, reading to him from his favorite book of myths and monsters, stories of creatures who walked between worlds. He had fallen asleep with his small hand clutching mine, his face peaceful in a way that made my chest ache. I was leaving his room when I found Dante in the corridor, waiting. He asked me to walk with him. Not a command, but a request. And I followed. He led me through the mansion, through corridors I'd never seen, past rooms that seemed to breathe with age and secrets. We ended up in the conservatoria, glass-walled room filled with night-blooming flowers that released their perfume into the darkness. He asked me if I knew what it was like to live for centuries and feel nothing. To watch the world turn, to see empires rise and fall, to lose everyone you've ever loved to time, until loving becomes impossible. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He continued, his voice barely above a whisper, telling me he'd stopped feeling 100 years ago. That he'd told himself it was mercy, that numbness was better than the alternative, that caring was a weakness he couldn't afford. He turned then, and his eyes, those ancient silver eyes, were full of something that looked like pain. He told me that then I walked into his son's room, a servant girl with rough hands and a soft heart. That I made Elias smile made him hope, and that I made Dante remember what it felt like to be human. I started to say I wasn't trying to be anything, but he raised a hand to stop me. He said he knew, and that's what made it worse. that I wasn't trying to be anything other than kind. And kindness, in a world like this, was revolutionary. He stepped closer, and I felt the cold radiating from him, felt the ancient power that hummed beneath his skin. He could kill me without effort, could drain me, could break me, could make me disappear as if I'd never existed. Instead, he reached out and touched my face with fingers like ice. He whispered that he shouldn't want this, shouldn't want me. But he did, and that terrified him more than anything he'd faced in 300 years. My heart was thunder in my chest. I asked what he was saying. He told me that I'd woken something in him he thought was dead. That when he looked at me, he didn't see a servant. He saw the first person in a century who'd made him want to be more than a monster. I told him he wasn't a monster, and I meant it. His laugh was bitter. He said I didn't know what he'd done, what he was, that he'd killed, that he'd fed on humans, drained them, left them hollow, that he'd lived in darkness so long he forgot what light looked like. I reminded him that he loved his son. The words hung between us, fragile and fierce. He said yes, finally, that he loved his son, and that he thought, God help him, he was beginning to love me. The world stopped. The air went still. Everything narrowed to his eyes, to his cold hand on my face, to the impossible truth hanging between us. I whispered that this was wrong. He said he knew. I said it would destroy us. He said he knew that too. I said I should leave, should run as far from here as I could. His thumb traced my cheekbone as he acknowledged this. Then he asked, "But would I?" And there it was. The question that would determine everything. The choice that would seal both our fates. I should have said yes. Should have gathered my things and fled into the night. Should have saved myself while I still could. But I had never been good at self-preservation. I breathed the word no. I wouldn't leave. And when he kissed my cold lips against warm, death-tasting life, I felt something crack open inside me. Something wild and reckless and utterly doomed. We both knew how this would end. In blood, in tears, in ruin. But in that moment, wrapped in his arms, tasting eternity on his lips, I didn't care. Now, as I write these words, I know the truth. I was never meant to survive this story. Humans do not belong in the arms of vampires, and love does not belong in a world divided by blood. But for a moment, I was seen. For a moment, I was loved, and perhaps that is enough. After that night, everything changed. Dante no longer hid his interest, no longer pretended our connection was purely about his son. He sought me out in quiet moments, found excuses to be near me, looked at me with eyes that held centuries of longing finally unleashed. And I let him. God help me, I let him. We were careful, we had to be. The household was already suspicious, already watching. Mrs. Thorne's eyes followed me like a hawk tracking a mouse. The other servants whispered behind their hands, and the vampire elite who visited the estate, Dante's peers, his contemporaries, looked at me with expressions ranging from amusement to disgust. A human and a vampire. It wasn't forbidden, exactly. There were no laws against it, but there were expectations. Unspoken rules that had governed vampire society for centuries. Vampires took human lovers, yes, but they were always temporary. Playthings. Sources of blood and pleasure that could be discarded. When the novelty wore off, what Dante and I had was different. And difference, in their world, was dangerous. Elias sensed the change before anyone said a word. His drawings shifted. Instead of lone figures in darkness, he began sketching pairs. Two shadows intertwined. Hands reaching across impossible distances. And in the corner of every image, a small figure watching, waiting, hoping. He was drawing us. Drawing what he wanted. A family. And that broke my heart more than anything, because I knew we couldn't give him that. We were playing with fire ore, rather, with something far colder and more deadly. And when it burned us, Elias would be the one left in the ashes. But I couldn't stop. Every stolen moment with Dante felt like breathing after years underwater. His touch, cold but tender, awakened something in me I hadn't known existed. His words, centuries of poetry and philosophy distilled into whispers-filled spaces in my soul I'd thought permanently empty. He told me about his human life, so long ago he could barely remember it. A peasant boy in medieval Italy, dying of plague at 17. He told me about his maker, a cruel vampire who'd turned him for sport and abandoned him to figure out immortality alone. He told me about the wars he'd fought, the loves he'd lost, the slow erosion of his humanity over centuries of darkness. He said I made him remember what it felt like to be alive. I insisted that he was alive. But he disagreed. He explained that he was animated, that there was a difference. He breathed because his body remembered breathing, but didn't need air. His heart beat because it hadn't forgotten how, but no blood flowed. He was a shadow of life, he said, an echo. But when he was with me, when he felt my warmth, my pulse, he pressed his palm against my throat. Feeling the blood rushing beneath my skin, when he felt that, he remembered what life actually was. I whispered, asking if it hurt to remember. He said yes, but that it was a good pain. The kind that proves something matters. I understood, because loving him hurt too. Hurt because I knew every moment was borrowed time. Hurt because I knew the world would never accept us. Hurt because I was falling deeper into something that could only end in destruction. The household continued to fracture around us. Mrs. Thorne confronted me again, her words sharper, her threats less veiled. She told me I was playing a dangerous game, that Master Dante might be infatuated now that vampires tired of their toys. And when he was done with me, there wouldn't be anything left to discard. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that what we had was real. But how could I be sure? How could a human ever truly know the mind of something that had lived for centuries? How could I trust that his feelings weren't just the novelty of my mortality, my warmth, my humanity, things that would lose their luster once the initial fascination faded? But then he would look at me with those ancient eyes full of wonder, would hold me as if I were something precious and breakable, would whisper my name like a prayer, and all my doubts would dissolve. Elias grew more attached to both of us. He began positioning himself between us, taking Dante's hand in one of his and mine in the other, creating a chain, creating a family. His drawings showed the three of us together, always together, and in his child's mind he believed it could last forever. I tried to prepare him, tried to explain, in the gentle way one explains death to a child, that what we had was temporary, that I was human and would age, that the household wanted me gone, that the world outside would never understand. But he would just shake his head and draw more pictures. Pictures of us in sunlight, though Dante couldn't walk in sun. Pictures of us in a small house far from the mansion. Though Dante could never leave his estate, vampires were bound to their ancestral holdings. Pictures of happiness that could never exist outside his imagination, and it killed me to watch him hope. The trouble began in earnest when Lucian Ashford returned. Dante's father, the patriarch of the family, ancient beyond measure, some said he'd walked the earth for over 1,000 years. He'd been away for months, traveling in Europe on business I didn't understand and wasn't privy to. His return was announced one evening with little warning. The household erupted into chaos, servants running to prepare rooms, Mrs. Thorne barking orders, the very air seeming to grow heavier with dread. Dante found me urgently in the servants' quarters and told me his father couldn't know about us. He explained that Lucian was old-world, traditional, that the idea of a vampire forming genuine attachment to a human, alone one of the serving class, he'd see it as weakness, as betrayal of everything he'd built. I suggested we stop, go back to how things were. though the words tasted like ash. Dante asked if we could. If I could pretend I didn't feel this, if I could look at him and not. I admitted I couldn't. He said neither could he. He pressed his forehead to mine, his cold skin against my warmth, and told me we'd hide, be careful, protect what we had until he could find a way to make his father understand. But Lucian Ashford was not a creature who could be deceived easily. He'd survived a millennium by reading people, by seeing through facades, by understanding the deeper currents that moved beneath surface appearances. He arrived in a black carriage pulled by horses that looked like they'd galloped out of nightmare, too large, too still, their eyes reflecting red in the lamplight. He emerged draped in finery from another era, his face sharp and ageless, his eyes like chips of obsidian. The household assembled to greet him, servants lined up in perfect formation, heads bowed. I stood among them, trying to disappear, trying to be invisible like I once was. His gaze swept over us like a blade, and when it landed on me, I felt it. Cold recognition, ancient knowledge. He saw me, truly saw me, in a way that made my blood run cold. He asked Dante to present his household. And so my master, my love, introduced his servants one by one. When he came to me, I felt his hesitation, heard the slight catch in his voice as he told his father this was Sira, who cared for Elias. Lucian asked if I did, stepping closer, towering over me. He moved with the grace of a predator, and every instinct I had screamed at me to run. He commanded me to look at him. I raised my eyes, though it took every ounce of courage I had. His face was beautiful and terrible, perfect as a marble statue and just as cold. But his eyes held something worse than cruelty. They held understanding. He knew. Somehow, he knew. He murmured that I was interesting. Then louder, he said to bring his grandson to him. He would see how the boy had grown. The meeting between Lucian and Elias was painful to watch. The old vampire studied his grandson with something between disappointment and disgust. Elias couldn't speak, couldn't explain himself, could only hold up his drawings with trembling hands. Lucian barely glanced at them. He remarked to Dante that the boy was still damaged, as if Elias weren't there. That he'd hoped age would strengthen him, but he was as broken as ever. He suggested they consider alternatives, other bloodlines, other potential heirs. Dante's voice was steel as he stated that Elias was his son, Lucian's grandson, and that he was not broken. Lucian countered that the boy couldn't speak, couldn't command, couldn't lead their family into the next century. He asked what use was an heir who couldn't even announce his own name. Before I could stop myself, I said that he communicated. The room went silent. Every eye turned to me. I'd just interrupted a conversation between vampire lords. I'd just spoken out of turn. I'd just signed my own death warrant. Lucian's smile was thin and sharp. He said, "The servant speaks. How novel." He asked what made me an authority on his grandson's capabilities. I told him I'd spent time with Elias, that I'd seen his art, his drawings, that he was brilliant, that he saw the world in ways others couldn't, that his silence wasn't emptiness, it was depth. Lucian repeated the word art with contempt. He said his grandson, heir to a bloodline that had ruled this city for 300 years, makes pictures. How quaint. Dante began to speak, but Lucian cut him off. He said he wanted to hear this, that the human servant believed she understood their world better than they did. He told me to please enlighten him, to tell him how I divined the inner workings of vampire nobility from my position scrubbing floors. Heat flooded my face, but I pushed forward. I told him I understood that Elias was a child who needed love, not judgment, that he'd been isolated and ignored when he should have been cherished, that he had gifts no one bothered to see because they were too busy measuring him against expectations he was never meant to meet. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Lucian laughed. Not a warm laugh, something cold and cutting that echoed through the room like breaking glass. He turned to Dante with eyes full of dark amusement and said his son had been very careless, hadn't he? That this wasn't just about the boy, this was about me. Dante claimed he didn't know what Lucian meant, but his voice was hollow. Lucian told him not to insult his intelligence, that he could smell it on both of us, the attachment, the longing, the utterly foolish, completely reckless bond we'd formed. He circled us like a shark, saying a vampire lord and a human servant. How deliciously tragic, how predictably pathetic. Dante begged his father to please stop. Lucian asked, please what? To pretend he didn't see what was happening under his own roof? To ignore the fact that Dante had compromised himself, his position, his son's future, all for... He gestured at me dismissively. For this? Dante said quietly, but with warning in his voice that my name was Sira, and that Lucian would speak of me with respect. Lucian asked, or what? If Dante would challenge him, his own sire, the head of this family. He told Dante they both knew how that would end. Elias had been watching this exchange with growing distress. Now his hands flew, drawing shapes in the air, his language of panic and fear. I moved to him instinctively, kneeling beside him and murmuring that it was all right. Lucian commanded me not to touch his grandson. Dante stepped between us, saying I'd been touching Elias for months, that I'd been healing him, helping him, giving him what they couldn't acceptance. Lucian said I'd been poisoning the boy, making him soft, making him weak, and that I'd been doing the same to Dante. His eyes flashed red, the first sign of true vampire anger. He declared that this ended now, that I would leave tonight, be compensated for my service and escorted from the grounds. If I ever returned, if I ever attempted to contact either of them, I would be dealt with permanently. Dante said no. His voice was flat, final. Lucian's eyebrows rose. He asked if Dante was refusing him, choosing a human over his family, over his legacy. Dante said he was choosing love over fear, connection over tradition. That he was choosing to be more than what they'd become, predators hiding behind civility, monsters pretending at nobility. Lucian's voice dripped with sarcasm as he called it romantic, and utterly stupid. He asked if Dante thought love made him strong, because it made him weak. It made him vulnerable. It gave his enemies a target. He said every vampire who'd ever truly loved a human had watched them age, wither, and die. Every single one had been destroyed by that loss. Dante was setting himself up for devastation. Dante said then he'd be devastated. But at least he'd have lived. At least he'd have felt something real. Father and son stared at each other, centuries of family history and expectation hanging between them like a blade. Finally, Lucian spoke, his voice soft and deadly. He said if I stayed, Dante was cut off. No more family support, no more protection. The other vampire houses would see him as weak, as compromised. They'd come for him, for his son, and Lucian wouldn't stop them. Dante said, so be it. Lucian called him a fool. Dante agreed, he probably was. But he glanced at me, at Elias, and said he was a fool who finally understood what mattered. Lucian turned to leave, then paused at the door. He told Dante I would die, that humans always do. And when I did, when he was left with nothing but memories and grief not to come crawling back, that Dante would have made his choice and would have to live with it, or rather exist with it, for eternity. The door slammed behind him with a finality that shook the walls. The household fractured completely after that night. Half the servants quit immediately, unwilling to stay in a house that had earned the patriarch's displeasure. Those who remained treated me like a plague carrier, something dangerous and infectious that might bring disaster down on all their heads. Mrs. Thorne was particularly vicious. One morning she hissed at me that I'd ruined this family, that I'd destroyed a legacy that stood for 3 centuries, all because I couldn't keep my place. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was a poison, corrupting everything I touched. But when I looked at Elias's smile, at the way he flourished under love and acceptance, I couldn't regret it. And when Dante held me, when he looked at me with eyes that had finally learned to feel again, I knew I'd do it all over. But the cost was mounting. Other vampire families began to circle like wolves, scenting blood. They sent representatives to the estate, cold, ancient creatures who looked at Dante with contempt and at me with hunger. They saw opportunity in his perceived weakness. I heard one of the remaining servants whisper that they were testing him, testing whether he was still strong enough to hold his territory. If they decided he wasn't, the sentence hung unfinished, but I understood. Vampire politics were brutal. Show weakness, and you'd be consumed by those stronger than you. Dante tried to shield me from the worst of it, but I saw the strain. He held more meetings, made more concessions, worked harder to prove his strength while simultaneously refusing to give me up. It was an impossible balance, and we both knew it. One night, as we sat in the conservatory, our sanctuary, our refuge from the crumbling world outside, I told him he should let me leave. That Lucian was right, that I was making him weak, painting a target on his back. He said no firmly. His hand tightened on mine as he told me I was making him strong in the ways that mattered, that they saw love as weakness because they'd forgotten what it meant to have something worth fighting for. I brought up Elias, worried they could take him. Dante said they could try, but they'd have to go through him first, and 300 years of existence had taught him how to fight. Still, the pressure mounted. Letters arrived daily from vampire council members, from old allies, from Lucian himself, all urging Dante to come to his senses, to remember his obligations, to put aside childish attachments for the good of the bloodline. And through it all, I watched Dante age in ways that had nothing to do with years, watched the weight settle heavier on his shoulders, watched him sacrifice piece after piece of his power, his influence, his standing, all to keep me safe. It was killing him, not literally, vampires don't die so easily, but it was killing the part of him that had just started to live again. Elias understood more than we thought. One evening, he presented me with a drawing that stole my breath. It showed 3 figures, him, Dante, and me, but we were fragmenting, cracking like broken glass. And around us, shadows gathered with teeth and claws. He knew we were under siege. He knew the world wanted to tear us apart. I held him close, this beautiful, silent boy who saw too much, and whispered that I was sorry. He pulled back and looked at me with eyes too old for his face. Then he drew again quick, urgent sketches. The 3 of us standing together against the darkness. Together, not broken. Together, fighting. He was telling me not to give up. This child, who had every reason to accept the world's cruelty, was telling me to keep fighting. And so I did. But the breaking point came on a night when the moon hung red in the sky, what the vampires called a blood moon, a time when their hunger was strongest, their control weakest. Dante had been called to a council meeting, all the vampire lords of the city, gathering to discuss what they called the situation, meaning me, meaning whether they would allow him to continue harboring a human he'd grown attached to. He'd wanted me to stay hidden, locked in my room where I'd be safe. But I'd never been good at hiding. I'd gone to Ilias's room, thinking I'd keep him company while his father was gone. But when I arrived, I found the door ajar and the room empty. Panic seized me. I called for Elias, rushing into the corridor, my voice echoing back to me. No answer, just my own voice in the empty halls. I searched frantically, my heart pounding. The mansion was too large, with too many rooms, too many places a small boy could be lost. Or taken. I found him in the West Wing, the forbidden section where even servants didn't go. He was cornered by 3 vampires I didn't recognize, their eyes glowing red in the darkness, their fangs extended. They weren't from our household. They were outsiders, enemies. One of them crooned that Elias was such a pretty little thing, broken, but pretty. He wondered if the boy's blood tasted as sweet as he looked. I screamed at them not to touch him, putting myself between them and the boy. They laughed, a sound like nails on glass. The tallest one said here was the famous human, the servant who thought she was a queen, the mortal who'd brought House Ashford to its knees. I told them to let Elias go, that this was between them and Dante. He said no, that this was about showing my vampire lord the price of weakness, about reminding him what happened when you valued human cattle over your own kind. He moved faster than I could track, suddenly inches from my face, and told me they were going to hurt Dante's son, then hurt me. Then leave him to suffer, knowing he brought this on himself. I felt Elias trembling behind me, his small hands clutching my dress. I had no weapons, no strength, no way to fight creatures who'd lived for centuries and fed on violence. But I had rage, and sometimes rage is enough. I said they'd have to kill me first, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. He smiled wider and said, oh, they would, but not quickly. He reached for me, and I braced for pain, for death, for whatever came next. Instead, the world exploded into violence. Dante appeared like a storm of fury, moving so fast he was barely visible. He hit the lead vampire with enough force to crack the walls, his fangs bared, his eyes blazing with inhuman rage. His voice shook the foundations as he demanded to know if they dared attack his son, dared threaten me. The fight was brutal and brief. 3 against 1 should have been terrible odds, even for an ancient vampire. But Dante fought like something unleashed, like centuries of control finally snapping. He was beautiful and terrible, graceful and savage, a reminder that beneath the civilized veneer, vampires were apex predators. When it was over, 2 of the intruders were dead, truly dead, their bodies turning to ash. The 3rd fled, wounded and terrified. Dante stood among the ruins, covered in blood that wasn't his, breathing hard though he didn't need air. When he turned to me, I saw the monster behind the man, saw what he truly was, what he'd always been, what he could never stop being. He'd killed for me. For us. And somehow, that should have terrified me. Should have made me run screaming into the night. Instead, I ran to him, threw myself into his arms, not caring about the blood, about the death, about anything except that we were alive and together. I sobbed into his chest that he came. He whispered, holding me like I was the most precious thing in existence, that he would always come for me. Behind us, Elias watched with wide eyes. He'd seen his father kill, had seen the truth of what vampires were, should have been traumatized, destroyed by the violence. Instead, he smiled, because his father had protected us, because we were still a family, because love, in the end, was worth fighting for. The council meeting ended in chaos when news of the attack reached them. Dante had killed representatives from another vampire House Anne act that could spark war, but he'd done it protecting his heir and his household, which was his right. The vampire lords were divided. Some called for his execution. Others admired his strength, his willingness to defend what was his regardless of consequence. Still others simply wanted the whole situation to disappear, to go back to the comfortable status quo where everyone knew their place. Lucian Ashford, surprisingly, defended his son. His voice carried the weight of 1,000 years as he declared that whatever foolishness Dante had engaged in, he was still his blood, still a lord of this city, that he'd responded to an attack on his household as any of them would have, with violence, with finality. If they wanted to condemn him for that, they condemned all of them. It was the last thing I expected. Lucian, who'd threatened me, who'd tried to drive me away, now protecting the son who'd chosen me over family approval. Later, when I asked Dante about it, he smiled sadly. He explained that his father was many things, but not a hypocrite. That Lucien disapproved of me, but respected strength. And standing against the council, against tradition, against the entire vampire world for love, he saw that as strength, even if he thought it was foolishly applied. I asked if Lucien would ever accept us. Dante said he didn't know, but that he'd stopped needing his acceptance. He had mine. He had Ilias's. That was enough. But was it? Could it be? The days after the attack were strange and heavy. The household was different, quieter, more watchful. Those servants who remained looked at me with new eyes. I wasn't just the upstart servant anymore. I was the human worth killing for. The mortal who'd brought vampire lords to violence. Some respected that. Others feared it. None could ignore it. Elias stayed closer to both of us, as if afraid we'd disappear if he looked away. His drawings shifted again. Now they showed us surrounded by protective walls, by barriers against the darkness. He was drawing fortresses, drawing survival, and in a way that's what we became, a fortress of 3 holding against a world that wanted to tear us apart. Dante taught me to fight. He said if they came again, and they would, I needed to be able to protect myself. He showed me where vampires were vulnerable, how to move, how to use their speed against them. I'd never be strong enough to defeat one in direct combat, but I could slow them down, could buy time for help to arrive. I hated that it was necessary, hated that loving him meant learning how to kill, but I learned anyway, because surviving meant adapting, and I was tired of being helpless. Months passed, the seasons turned, and slowly, grudgingly, the vampire community accepted that Dante wasn't backing down, that I wasn't going anywhere, that this strange, forbidden arrangement was permanent. Some houses cut ties with the Ashfords entirely. Others remained neutral, watching and waiting to see how it would all end. A few surprisingly reached out with cautious acceptance. One ancient vampire told Dante at a gathering I wasn't invited to that he was setting a precedent, that other vampires were watching. If Dante could keep a human close, could love openly, could build something beyond blood and power, maybe they could too. It was a revolution disguised as a scandal, and we were at the center of it. But revolutions are dangerous. They destabilize. They threaten those in power. And they always, always demand sacrifice. The sacrifice came on a winter night when snow fell like ash over the city. I was in my room. I still kept my small servants' quarters, though no one would have objected if I'd moved to the family wing when I heard the sound. Not footsteps, not voices, just a feeling, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. Danger was coming. I moved quickly, heading for Ilias's room, but the corridors had changed. Shadows moved wrong. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath. More vampires, more enemies. But this time, they'd come prepared, come in numbers. I reached Ilias's door to find it locked from the inside. He'd barricaded himself in smart boy. I knocked in our pattern, the signal that meant safety. The door cracked open, and I slipped inside, whispering for him to stay quiet, though he never made sound anyway. I told him his father would come, but I wasn't sure he would. Wasn't sure he even knew. This attack had been coordinated, planned. They'd waited until Dante was away on business, until the household was vulnerable. The door burst open in an explosion of splinters. 5 vampires poured into the room, their eyes glowing, their fangs extended, and leading them was someone I recognized, one of Lucien's most trusted lieutenants. He told me, almost apologetically, that nothing was personal, but that the old order must be maintained. The boy was weak, and I was a contamination. Both problems would be solved tonight. I asked if Lucien sent him. He said Lucien looked the other way, which was permission enough. So this was it. The final play. Lucien had publicly defended his son but privately authorized this attack. Plausible deniability. He'd get rid of the problems without having to take responsibility. I stepped in front of Elias, knowing it was futile but unable to do anything else. I told them they'd have to go through me. The lieutenant agreed that yes, they would. They moved forward, and I prepared to die. But then the windows exploded inward, glass showering the room in a glittering storm, and Dante was there. Not the controlled lord I'd fallen in love with. This was something older, something primal. This was the vampire he'd been before civilization taught him to pretend at humanity. The fight was savage. Blood on the walls. Screams that would haunt my dreams. The sound of bones breaking, of flesh tearing, of death arriving on swift wings. When it ended, Dante stood alone among the corpses, his eyes still blazing red, his fangs still extended, blood dripping from his hands. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the fear in his eyes, fear that I'd finally seen too much, that this would be the thing that broke us. Instead, I went to him, took his blood-stained hands in mine, and whispered my thanks for protecting us. And something in him cracked. He pulled me close, buried his face in my hair, and for the first time in 300 years, Dante Ashford wept. He said he couldn't lose me, couldn't lose either of us, that he'd lived so long in darkness and I was the only light he'd found. If they took that from him, if they took me, I promised they wouldn't, that we were stronger than they were, because we had something they didn't. He asked what. I told him, each other. We had each other. Behind us, Elias had emerged from his hiding place. His hands flew, creating images in the air, his language of love and belonging. And though I couldn't see the exact shapes, I understood the meaning. Family. We were family, not by blood, not by tradition, but by choice, by love, by the willingness to fight for each other against a world that said we shouldn't exist. The attack forced Lucien's hand. He couldn't pretend ignorance anymore, couldn't hide behind plausible deniability. His lieutenant had been found among the dead, and that made him complicit. The Vampire Council demanded answers. A meeting was called, all the major houses, all the power players in the city's immortal community, and for the first time I was invited, not as a servant, not as an accessory, but as a participant, because this was about me. About us, about whether love could exist between species, between classes, between worlds. I wore the dress from the galley, the one that had made me feel like I belonged, even when I knew I didn't. Dante stood beside me, his hand in mine, and Elias stood on his other side, small but steady, his sketchbook clutched to his chest. We walked into that council chamber as a family, and the assembled vampires, ancient, powerful, terrifying, had no choice but to acknowledge us. Lucian spoke first, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. He said he'd underestimated the depths of his son's commitment, that he'd thought time would resolve this situation naturally, that the human would age and die, and Dante would return to reason. He looked at me, his ancient eyes unreadable, and said that he saw now that some bonds transcended mortality. And perhaps, he paused, seeming to struggle with the words, perhaps that wasn't weakness. Perhaps that was a different kind of strength. It wasn't an apology. Vampires of his age didn't apologize. But it was acknowledgement. Acceptance, however grudging. Other voices rose in support, in opposition, in confusion. The council was divided, as it had been from the beginning, but something had shifted. The old certainties were crumbling. Finally, the eldest among them, a vampire so ancient she'd supposedly walked with Cleopatra, spoke. Her voice was like wind through dead leaves as she said the world was changing. That we could change with it, or cling to the past until it buried us. She stated the facts. This human loved a vampire. This vampire loved a human. Their child thrived in ways he never did under traditional care. The question was whether they accepted facts or fought reality until it destroyed them. The silence that followed was profound. Then, one by one, the vampires began to vote, some for tradition, some for change, some abstaining, unwilling to commit either way. In the end, it was close. Terrifyingly close. But the vote came down on our side. We could stay together. Officially. Legally. Protected by vampire law instead of hunted by it. It wasn't perfect. Many vampires still disapproved, still saw me as an aberration. But disapproval, we could survive. What we couldn't survive was being declared enemies of the state. When we left that chamber, we left as a recognized family. Unusual, certainly. Controversial, absolutely. But real. Valid. Ours. The years that followed were not easy. They never are when you're building something new from the ruins of old expectations. But they were ours. Elias grew in it physically, as vampire children age slowly, but emotionally, creatively. His art gained recognition beyond the household, beyond the city. He became known not as the broken heir, but as a prodigy whose silence spoke louder than words ever could. Dante mellowed in ways I'd never expected. 300 years of ice began to thaw. He laughed more, touched more freely, allowed himself to hope in ways he'd thought lost forever. And I became something I'd never imagined. Not a servant, but not quite nobility either. Something in between. A bridge. A reminder that the old boundaries were more flexible than anyone had believed. We faced challenges. Of course we did. Some vampires never accepted us. Some humans were horrified by my choice. And there was always the specter of my mortality hanging over us. The knowledge that unless Dante turned me, our time was limited. We talked about it sometimes. Late at night, when Elias was asleep and the world was quiet, Dante would say he could make me like him, could give me eternity, and I'd counter that I could stay human, could remind him what it meant to be mortal. Neither option was perfect. Both had costs I wasn't sure I could pay. So we lived in the present, loved in the moment, built a life one day at a time, knowing that nothing lasts forever, but some things, some precious, beautiful things are worth having anyway, even if they're temporary. I write these words now as an old woman. 63 years have passed since that first night I spilled wine on a vampire's floor. 63 years since I looked into Elias's eyes and saw myself reflected back. My hair is gray now. My hands tremble when I hold a pen. My body aches in ways I never imagined when I was young and certain I could survive anything. Time has marked me in ways it will never mark Dante, in ways it barely touches Elias. They remain untouched by the centuries, frozen in the amber of immortality, while I decay slowly, inevitably back into the dust I came from. And yet, I am not afraid. Dante sits beside me now, as he has every day for 6 decades. His face is the same, still beautiful, still cold to the touch, still carrying the weight of endless years. But when he looks at me, I no longer see the monster others fear. I see the man who learned to love again. The one who chose feeling over numbness, who risked everything for a bond that defied reason. He still wishes to save me from death. He still asks to turn me, to make me eternal before I fade. And every time I've told him, not yet, not today, because I needed to finish this, to write the truth before memory crumbles and time steals what's left of me. Elias is grown now. His body remains young, but his eyes hold decades. He never learned to speak, but he found his own language art. His paintings fill galleries across the world, silent and luminous. He no longer needs words. His art speaks for him and for all of us. He calls me mother, though never aloud. He does it in gestures, in the way his hand finds mine, in the portraits he paints where I am always present, always loved. For someone born invisible, that love is a miracle. Mrs. Thorne is gone. 20 years now. On her deathbed, she asked to see me. I went, though her cruelty had once defined my fear. She said I had proven her wrong, that she thought I'd destroy them, but I had made them stronger. She called me hope, change, the reminder that stagnation, not transformation, is what kills us in the end. I held her hand as she died, and I wept for the softness the world never let her keep. Lucian Ashford visits rarely now, once a decade. The hostility between him and Dante has faded into quiet understanding. He brings gifts for Elias, speaks of legacy and history, and sometimes glances at me as though remembering something he can't name. Once he brought me a journal, fine leather, untouched pages. He said it was for my writings, for the truth of what happened here. It was the closest he ever came to admitting that my story mattered. Outside, the world has changed. The lines between vampires and humans blur more each year. Servants become equals. Households like ours open their doors to love that once would have been condemned. It isn't perfect, but it's better. And some say it began with me. They call me revolutionary, a symbol, but I know better. I never set out to change the world. I only wanted to survive, to care for a lonely boy, and to love a man who had forgotten how. The revolution was an accident. The change, a side effect. And yet, I'll claim it. Because if my small defiance made life kinder for those who came after, then it was all worth it. I used to dream of my brother, Micah, the child I couldn't save. Fever took him at 9. For years I carried the guilt like a wound that never healed. But Dante taught me something. I couldn't save Micah, but I saved Elias. I couldn't protect one child from death, but I saved another from loneliness. And through that, Micah's love lives on in every kindness, in every act of mercy, in every human I refuse to let disappear. Our estate has become a haven for the unwanted, the scarred, the broken, the forgotten. Those who don't fit in the polished halls of vampire houses, we pay them fairly. We see them, and they bloom. Elias insists on it. He knows what it means to be dismissed. Sometimes, when I watch him move through the halls, offering quiet gestures of compassion, I think, we did it. So we turned pain into purpose, silence into strength. But time always wins. My body began to fail. The pain grew constant. And Dante asked again, would I let him save me? Would I surrender mortality for eternity? I was terrified. Terrified of losing my humanity. Of becoming something other than the woman he loved. What if the empathy that shaped me vanished with my heartbeat? What if I forgot what it meant to be fragile? No one could answer. So I waited. Not yet. Not today. Until the day came when there were no more tomorrows. My heart began to fail, and every breath became a battle. Dante stayed beside me, silent and desperate. Elias sketched beside the bed, trying to capture me alive, as though his drawings could hold me here. And I realized they still needed me, even after everything. Maybe love isn't about being strong, but about being needed, even when strength is gone. I asked Dante to tell me what forever would look like. He spoke of centuries of watching the world transform, of learning endlessly, of helping others with no limit of time. He promised we'd use eternity for good, that we'd remember what it meant to be human. Elias wanted that too. In his silent eyes, I saw it. Stay. And I did. The transformation was agony, death disguised as salvation. Fire in my veins. A scream that tore through eternity. My heart slowed, stopped, and began again different, unneeded, but stubbornly alive. When I opened my eyes, the world had changed. Colors were sharper, sounds overwhelming. Hunger surged through me, violent, wild, ancient. I wanted to feed, to destroy. But Dante's voice cut through the storm, telling me I was stronger than it. And then Elias's hand, small, human, trusting, reached for mine. That touch saved me. It took weeks to learn control, to tame the hunger, to remember that I was still me. But I did. I learned that immortality doesn't erase humanity, it magnifies it. I am still Sira, still the girl who refused to look away. Only now I have time to do more. 20 years have passed since that night. My reflection is young again, but my soul is ancient. Dante and I have traveled across the world, watching it change, helping it heal. We use eternity not for decadence, but for compassion. We lift those the world ignores. Elias has become a legend. His art, a language that transcends every boundary. He teaches the world that silence is not emptiness, but power. He still lives with us. We are a family, unconventional, impossible, eternal. The world beyond our gates keeps evolving. More love between species, more kindness between worlds. And when I see that, I remember, sometimes change begins with a single act of defiance, a single heart refusing to harden. At night, when Dante reads and Elias paints by the window, I think of the servant girl I once was, the one who spilled wine and thought she didn't matter. She was wrong. She mattered. She changed everything. So if someone reads this long after I'm gone, I want them to know love is worth fighting for. Change is possible. And invisibility is not the same as powerlessness. Sometimes the quietest voices start the loudest revolutions. Sometimes the most broken people build the strongest families. We did. We are. We will. This is my story. My confession. The truth of how I was chosen, condemned, destroyed, and reborn. I never meant to be remembered, but I'm glad I will be. Because some stories, the real ones, the ones that cost everything, are worth telling, worth living, worth dying for, and worth, in the end, becoming immortal to continue. The end.